I introduce myself, Yann Algan, the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, and I first want to share my warm welcome to everyone who is connected this evening. You know that this is really a special day for us. The event is organized on the occasion of the inauguration of the Sciences Po European Chair for Sustainable Development and Climate Transition. And the chair officially starts its work today, and it really reflects the continuity of Sciences Po engagement on sustainable development, which started 5 years ago with the climate initiative Make It Work, and with the relentless effort of some people like Laurence Toubiana, who will be present today, or Bruno Latour. The chair is resolutely transdisciplinary, seeking to develop integrated thinking to help resolve complex challenges of climate transition, economic development, and something which would be key today to foster social inclusion. Let me say that the chair is co-hosted by the School of International Affairs and the School of Public Affairs at Sciences Po, and it is headed by our beloved Professor Shiv Somervar, who is present also today among us. And I really want to warmly thank our partners, since the chair is sponsored by Hermes, HSBC, and the European Investment Bank, and we thank them really warmly for their support. So let me introduce really briefly the topic of the panel. As you know, Europe is really at the forefront globally on social, economic, and environmental rights. However, the European project itself is now under scrutiny within societies, animated by widening income and wealth inequality, political and social polarization, and lasting human and economic damages, especially from the current COVID-19 pandemic. And so we are really truly looking to the distinguished members of the panel for ideas to help forge a stronger and more resilient Europe through the lens of territorial inclusion. The event today gathers 4 distinguished guests, all European at heart. I first want to welcome Elisa Ferreira, the European Commissioner for Cohesion and Reforms, and who will open the discussion. And then we will continue the panel with 3 guests. First with Laurence Toubiana, who is the CEO of the European Climate Foundation. Thank you very much, Laurence, for being here tonight. We'll then have a follow-up discussion with Joaquim Oliveira Martins, who is Deputy Director at the OECD for the Center for Entrepreneurship, Regions and Cities. And then Charlotte Alpern will conclude. Charlotte Alpern is researcher at Sciences Po and the Center of European Studies. We are really lucky to have such a distinguished panel, and I propose to open the floor with you, Elisa Ferreira.
Dear Yann Algan, dear Ricoletta, dear members of the panel, Laurence Toubiana, Joaquim Oliveira Martins, Charlotte Alpern, dear professors, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. My deep thanks for the invitation and also for the choice of these important topics for discussion. Let me first congratulate you for the strong European-minded discussions you have been promoting. I am sure that Enrico Letta is no stranger to that. I also feel encouraged that such a prestigious institution as Sciences Po is paying close attention to the importance of our territory. For too long, policymakers have been spatially blind. And this is a huge mistake, because the same decisions and the same policies can have a completely different impact on different places. And it is our responsibility to bridge this divide between general policies and their impacts on real people in real places and in real time. So ladies and gentlemen, today I will try to make 2 points. First, why territories and territorial inclusion matter. Second, how can we ensure that future investments increase territorial inclusion and resilience? First, territories matter. Corona crisis is just the most clear example of this. The virus is a common exogenous shock, but it has asymmetric impact across European countries and regions. The virus spreads more quickly in cities than in rural areas. The economic crisis hits certain places more than others. It hits certain industries and spares others. Tourism, for instance, is particularly affected, and some regions depend heavily on this. Many local shops and local restaurants and local businesses, they suffer. But for instance, Amazon prospers. Solution is not macroeconomic only, boosting aggregate demand. The territorial aspect is crucial. Territory will matter even more in the recovery. The lessons of every economic recovery in modern times is that recovery, as well as crisis, is also asymmetric at the regional level. In the oil shock of the 1970s, the trend was for service regions to bounce back, while manufacturing regions struggled for a decade or more. And similarly, after the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, some regions almost naturally bounced back, while others still struggle a decade later. So in the current crisis, we know that many regions will struggle in recovery and will need particular help. We do not yet know for sure which regions, but there are already primarily findings from the European Commission and from the Committee of Regions. And economic history clearly shows us that recovery will be asymmetric. Territory also matters for our green ambitions. In my visit to mining regions in Poland back in January, when we could still travel, I met a 50-year-old miner, and it never went out of my mind what he said to me. He said, well, I understand that this green transition needs to happen. I want a healthier world for my grandchildren, but I've been working in this mine for over 20 years. What is going to happen to me? This is not an easy question to answer. And this miner, he's not alone. Around 250,000 Europeans are employed in coal-related activities, peat extraction, and oil shale industry. These carbon-intensive industries are heavily concentrated. Regions where a quarter of employment depends on these industries will need support. Territory also matters for social inclusion. Even before COVID, youth unemployment varied from 4 or 5% in some regions to over 50% in others. And I can assure you that COVID is not making the situation at all better. What happens in regions where young people cannot get a job right now? How can a region thrive while using less than half of its young population in the business and in creating value? Especially when we look at the challenges ahead, the digital revolution. The transition to green economy, for all these challenges, we need the resources and the energy of young people. But territory also matters from a political perspective. There is an interesting text, it's called Geography of Discontent. And there is a growing body of academic literature on this topic. Populism and discontent with the democratic process have a strong territorial dimension. If we live in regions that are behind, we cannot expect their inhabitants to support a system that apparently does not deliver for them, doesn't need them. For all these reasons, territory matters. It matters in the crisis and it matters in the recovery. It matters for the green transition and for social inclusion. It matters if we want to understand populism. We cannot tackle these issues if we are spatially blind. This brings me to my second point. Our policies need to be spatially aware for Europe to be stronger and more resilient. As you so correctly titled today's panel, territorial inclusion and a stronger, more resilient Europe. Regional disparities are not inevitable. We can take steps to correct them. This is why we have cohesion policy in Europe. This is why I have been advocating for strong place-based policies, and I have lots of friends with me, namely Joaquim Oliveira Martins, for strong place-based policies also in recovery. Cohesion policy proved its relevance in the crisis. We enabled member states to mobilize their unspent cohesion funds to address the immediate impact of the crisis. At this moment, 16 billion euros of European cohesion investment has been mobilized to address these demands. Investments are being delivered on the ground. Cohesion policy funds have been financing 1 billion items of personal protective equipment, masks and so forth, as well as supporting 500,000 small businesses and giving direct support to around 1 million workers. Crucially, these needs were identified locally and delivered by local and regional program managers. The lockdown made everything local, and we in cohesion policy benefited from this tried and tested territorial method. That is to say, our close partnership with local level. But if COVID has been a crisis, it must be also an opportunity for new beginning, an opportunity to build back better, an opportunity also to deliver at the European level a changed new environment. We have made the historic decision for the first time ever to borrow massively on financial markets to support a robust recovery through loans and through grants. By the way, we have already started with 3 emissions of social bonds under another instrument called SURE, worth up to 100 billion euros to help protect jobs and keep people in work. There was very strong investor interest and the bonds were oversubscribed, resulting in favorable pricing terms. This was a vote of confidence in the EU as issuer and borrower. So through borrowing in the markets, Europe's financial firepower doubles. And cohesion policy is an integral part of the most ambitious recovery plan the European Union has ever seen. I hope that we'll get past the current block to get a Europe with the means, a Europe with the opportunity, and a Europe with the vision. A vision to be greener, to be more digital, a vision to be more resilient, and a vision to be socially and territorially more cohesive. The green and digital part are well known. A carbon neutral continent by 2050 and an innovation-driven economy. Being more resilient has to do with our capacity to cope with the crisis, but also to be more autonomous and stand on our own feet, European feet. However, for all this, we need the social and the territorial dimensions. We must tackle spatial imbalances. We must tackle them and transform them in economic opportunities. No region can be left behind. No European citizen can feel forgotten. This is why, to support the climate transition, we proposed also the Just Transition Fund, which will cushion the social economic impact on regions more heavily dependent on carbon. This is also why, to avoid a sudden rise in unemployment, the European Union has proposed the SURE mechanism that I just referred to, which can finance and is financing short-time work schemes to keep people in their jobs. As part of our recovery long-term vision, we also need to reflect on the way we organize our space and move away from a continuous overload of already overloaded agglomerations. A network of multipolar, mid-sized cities is better for quality life, for shorter commutes, for accessible jobs, and for time with family. Métro, boulot, dodo has ruled for too long. It is time for a change. This is good for the environment too. Mid-sized citizens means shorter commutes and 10-minute cities where you can walk or bike in 10 minutes to most amenities. You will probably notice that this vision is better for your health too. Who would not prefer a 10-minute walk in clean air to a 6-minute commute in petrol fumes? This is more territorially balanced world increases resilience too. This kind of territorial organization increases resilience. Instead of one big city, we have more cities and more diversified economic activities function in a network. Your finance professor would call this a broader and more balanced portfolio. Any future settlement pattern must include a plan for the provision of public goods. The modern economy and modern life depends on an increasing range of public goods. There are the classic ones, such as education, health service, and transport. But green and a more digital life requires access to more public services, such as a good broadband, clean water, soil and air, recycling systems and circular economy, renewable energy, and cycle paths under the sustainable transport. We must provide coverage. This is obviously essential to maintain a given settlement pattern, but it also goes to the heart of democracy. Every citizen must have access to minimum services so that we can speak truly about democratic participation. And this, by the way, is a challenge in a Europe where in some regions, we are only just now completing the water and waste water treatment networks. So there is a lot of work to be done. In conclusion, territory matters, place matters. I hope I have at least tried to convince you that it is not enough to know what is happening. You must also have a clear idea of where it is happening. We must understand that the main challenge of today have a strong spatial dimension. The recovery from COVID, the transition to a carbon neutral economy, social exclusion, populism, none of them can be understood or tackled if we are spatially blind. But the same is true for the opportunities of tomorrow. Greater quality of life, a more sustainable settlement pattern, modern governance and public services, none of them make sense without their spatial dimension. So how do we move forwards? We must always argue for this spatial awareness to policy. This is the heart of cohesion policy, which once again proves its relevance. It is neither old-fashioned nor outdated. In our current situation, we need, and the proof is there, we need cohesion policy. We also need spatial awareness in other policies and investment plans. Each member state will now draw up their strategies for using the European Union funds for the next financial period. We all must ensure that none of them are spatially blind and that everyone prioritizes territorial inclusion and this vision of a better distribution of activity and of public goods across territories. We need strong expert voices like yours arguing for this. Together, we can do this. And I am encouraged by today's initiative. Let us always remember that the biggest goals must be translated at the territorial level. As the old saying goes, think global, but act local. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Elisa Ferreira. You are a European commissioner that really share also both a sense of awareness, but also a lot of optimism on what Europe can do. And I guess that there will be a lot of questions about the different investment plan that you are launching for social inclusion and social cohesion on the different territories. And as you have rightly stressed, this issue is not a social or an economic issue, but is also a real democratic challenge in terms of resilience of our society. And so I take this opportunity to give the floor to Laurence Toubiana. Laurence, we know that on top of you, in addition to your current situation of CEO of the European Climate Foundation, you have worked a lot on previous international agreement, especially with the Paris Climate Agreement. You have worked also a lot on new democratic actually initiative with citizens in France in the context of what we call the consultation citoyenne. And so we are really lucky to have your thought on all these issues.
Thank you, Yann. Thank you, Yann Algan. Thank you, Enrico Letta, for this invitation to launch the chair that Shiv will run. It's a big privilege, and of course, very happy to be with you on this very important day. As Elisa just said, we are in a process of a big transformation in Europe because of the decision to go with implementing a big project with this, which is a new social contract around the Green Deal, which means that in a way having a target of being carbon neutral, climate neutral by 2050, and of course having a path to go there is a huge transformation, is a huge economical, technological, and social transformation. And we know that for the moment, of course, because it's a big transformation, the question is how this transformation is driven, how it is shared between citizens, and how we avoid the polarization Yann, you were mentioning in the beginning. And when we look at European societies, of course, and including the issue of climate change as well, by the way, as a number of other common problems, and COVID is only one of them, we see the polarization of the society and the way that the links between people have been weakened by a number of events. You refer to increasing inequality. It's certainly the major part, and Elisa referred to inequality between regions. So the risk we are running with an issue like climate change, again, implies that we go for a massive social change, which is, and in a way we can be honest as that it's not easily shared by the government. There is a lot, of course, of question about how the economy will react to that, how the society will react to that. So it's an issue that can really bring to a lot of polarization. And so the issue is how we avoid that the climate issue, which is still in a way owned by certainly a group of policymakers, experts, scientists, of course, that are taking care of that or that are anxious about the very dear impact we are facing already and will face, of course, more in the future, with a European Union standing up for climate change as a leader, a global leader. So I think the solution to that and the response to that, and one is probably to have a more nuanced judgment. It's not only an elite issue, it's not only a urban issue as well. Even there is, of course, right wings, left wing, different views of this issue, and a difference between as well citizen in cities, in citizen in the rural areas. But still, you see a majority of European citizens, and we conducted a number of polls together with many other institutions that shows that more than 60 to 70% of European citizens in each country, including countries like Poland or Hungary, or the one of the Visegrad group, who are not always a government, are not the more, in a way, pro-climate, strong climate policies, they are all concerned with climate change. So it is in a way, in the public opinion, is a strong element of probably common concern. Then the issue is how people would, and Elisa said very, very well, this will entail transformation on the, not only on the energy sector, as she's referred to, but the automotive sector, agriculture, transport, housing, everything will be changed by that policy. So I do think that the main issue, and in my view, we cannot bring such an important social change without having a democracy that functions very, very deeply well, which of course is not the case nowadays, in most of cases. And there is this distrust between citizens and their representative and the public institutions. I must say this distrust is both sides. No, probably the leaders, the political makers do think that the citizens are not ready and the citizens don't trust the governments. So we have, in a way, where this distrust that in particular you, Yann, has worked so much, is a radical obstacle to this tremendous, enormous change we have to bring to the societies. So my point on that is we can find a way, giving a citizen a voice and an active role in their own society and lives, giving agency to citizens is the best way to have a social and economic change that can really address the challenge of climate change and the way that we have to transform our production and consumption method and the way we live in a better way, by the way, because that, as Elisa said, is cleaner air, it's more healthy, and we could have a better relation with nature with that. But of course, if we don't put the citizen at the center of the process, that would be very difficult to avoid this polarization. But just to be beyond the polls, we can say that, look at US, where finally when the Trump administration decided to withdraw from Paris Agreement, there was a massive movement. And that's why, of course, climate change was so important in the recent electoral campaign in the United States, where this movement we call We Are Still In, which was a movement of people saying we don't agree with the central government that is withdrawing from a fight against climate change and for a global common. So this means that citizens can have a place at the global stage as well, and not only at the local one. I had the privilege recently to co-chair the governance committee of the French Citizen Assembly on Climate. It was an unprecedented experiment of 150 citizens selected randomly with a mandate to define a series of measures that we allow to achieve a reduction of at least 40% in greenhouse gas emission by 2030 compared to 1990 in a spirit of social justice. What we can conclude, even if a process is not totally completed, is there is a clear denial of the prejudice that the French people lack of interest in public affairs. That's not true. Their desire to give more substance to our citizenship. That's what they demonstrate during many, many months. We calculate it's now 500 days that during these 150 citizens have been working connected around this very, very long period to deliver a result, and they felt the responsibility. It has been a transformative experience for them as well as that for me, with a real empowerment and empowerment of the collective. It was a very inclusive discussions, very high quality deliberation and judgment that are very close to the public interest. And the following polls after the Citizen Assembly published his recommendation, his demands to the government, because that was the rule of the game. They were proposing a series of measures, and the President of the Republic agreed to pass these measures sans filtre, without filter to the parliament or the government. Their measures, their proposal receive a huge support from the French citizen in general, more than 70% for all their measures of approval. So this is a great democratic value compared to certain classic deliberation, because it's not a consultation. They were proposed even in written text that could be adopted almost immediately if there was, of course, a political backing for that. But the power of the collective intelligence shows that if you organize procedures and time and a moment of reflection, citizens who were not aware of the issue, on the gravity of the issue, can come with very innovative solutions. And they propose not only one measure or two measures, they propose a whole system of measures tackling all the issues of day-to-day life, from transport to housing to agriculture, artificialization, of land use, health concern, etc., biodiversity. And they even propose a reform of the constitution to put climate change as a part of the Article 1, the obligation of the French states. So I do think this is really innovative. Of course, we are all waiting for the response of the government in the form of a new law. The citizen would then evaluate the response of the government and make their final appraisal, probably beginning of next year. But that, anyway, this innovative form is copied by many other countries. We have a similar exercise in UK recently. We will have one very soon in Spain. And there is another one on the same topic in Germany before the elections. So it shows that we need to recreate this trust between citizen and public institution in face of a major change that will affect every element of our lives. But to do that, we need in a way, the two-way trust system to be re-engineered. And I do think that not only at local level, because of course this is about territories, inequalities and social justice, but it can even propose systems that connect the territories discussion and the local discussion to the global scene. And I'm a big believer of this multi-level governance system, that it's not just nation states who are should be at the table, but as well local actors that can really be respondent to global challenges as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence. Tubiana, I think we will have also a lot of questions on this issue of distrust of citizens towards government, but also of governments and experts towards citizens, and how we can rebuild trust. This is a really key issue. We do know that some of the reforms actually to handle climate change need also a political and social acceptability. And so a key issue is how do we build this social cohesion? And so it brings me to the next speaker, Joachim Oliveira. Thank you very much for being here. Joachim, actually, I turn to you as both an expert, but also as someone who at the OECD has done a lot to develop territorial indicators. I mean, it was really important. This is something that was lacking. And you have made a lot of effort at OECD to have some objective indicators with a broad map of all the different political, social, and also issues on inequalities. And at the OECD, you also actually give some pathway to develop inclusion and social inclusion in territories. So we will be really eager to have your insight about this topic.
Thank you so much, Yann, and really, I'm really very pleased to be here today to discuss about these issues. I would like to start with this rationale for what we could call a territorial or a place-based policy, like Commissioner Ferreira stressed. In some sense, why do we need to care about territorial inclusion to build a stronger and more resilient Europe, which is the theme of this seminar? You know, for example, I would say that most economists would say that on the aggregate level, productivity growth and technology are rarely against employment. Of course, we have these shocks on technology that may involve some transition or adjustment costs, but at the end, they are good for development. So some jobs can be destroyed in the process of reallocation, but many more are often created. So this is precisely the debate currently about what we call the future of work and the impact of automatization in the labor market. There are some more pessimistic views, more optimistic views, but overall at the aggregate level, people believe that this, I would say, complementarities between productivity, technology, and jobs can work. But at the local level, the trade-offs often appear very clear. Why? Because some regions are losing some sectors and firms, and probably new sectors and firms will not be created in the same place. Therefore, the question is always who wins and loses from this game. So usually economists assume that labor and firm and enterprise mobility take place responding to incentives, And so in the context of our increased, I would say, tertiarization of our economies, typically this means that high density areas gain and low density areas lose. Indeed, you know, in a services economy, a lot of our services require proximity. Services are 80% of our economies, 70, 80%. And so services require this proximity. And this is why services occur a lot in cities. And by the way, this is why this COVID shock has been so tough, I would say, for cities. So in some sense, this is it. This is the trends in the economy. High density favors productivity, agglomeration, etc., and low density loses. So in order to reap the benefits from this geographic reallocation, the idea is that we can compensate the losing regions. The problem is that there is a lot of evidence that this pure compensation, or I would say regional subsidies, do not work very well. Often they create a sort of perverse addiction to transfers, and instead of development, they actually create dependency. When we do nothing, the situation only tends to worsen over time, because we are dealing with, in some sense, with cumulative mechanisms, and at some point, it may be very difficult to deal with these problems. In the UK, for example, and I would say I find that a very enlightening fact, is that the share of steel industries in the 1960s at the regional level explains very well the stagnation, the current stagnation of some regions in the UK. So you see the kind of the time thickness of this sort of phenomenon. Geography is as this sort of thickness. Huh? So there is no sort of a sound evidence that the populist votes in many countries are actually related with these prolonged regional stagnation problems. So one gets, for example, this contrast that people know between the votes in cities and rural areas. This is the so-called geography of discontent that Commissioner Ferreira mentioned. So I think this all creates, I think, a very strong rationale to focus on this territorial inclusion and implement these place-based policies. Indeed, I would say that by tailoring policies to places, to geographies, to specificities, one can maximize the chances of finding more options to enhance productivity without hurting employment in a sort of very strong manner, or even promoting it in a smart way. This is all the agenda, European agenda, what we call smart specialization strategies. So with these appropriate policy packages, tailored, a bit differentiated by place, the regional or the local economy can also become more resilient. So this is our connection with all this debate about resilience, in the sense that it has, in doing this, we construct a system of governance that enables to deal with the shocks and strategically react to them. So in other words, this place-based approach is a way of facilitating the aggregate structural adjustment from the bottom up. Otherwise, the only option is to rely on this labor mobility and compensatory mechanisms, but as I said, both often do not work as expected. So at OECD, we organized these months a symposium on place-based policies, and actually the Commissioner Ferreira, attended this seminar and gave a very good contribution to this seminar. And there was also a contribution by Professor Tony Venables from Oxford. He gave, I would say, also very clearly rational why we need these place-based policies. And it was mainly based on the existence of what we call externalities. So either they are positive in the sense of these agglomeration economies, or they can also be negative. For example, when we have congestion, very big congestion in cities. So in a very simple way, Tony suggested that there are two main convergence mechanisms. Either people flow to jobs, or jobs flow to people. So people can fly to jobs, but this kind of out-migration can lead to a lot of vicious circles. For example, the best people, the more talented, more educated people move to the more vibrant regions like big cities. And in some sense, the lagging regions are caught in a low expectation trap. So sort of these cumulative problems. Now, jobs and of course firms can also fly to people. But as Tony stressed, these price signals tend often to be too small. He even used this very nice expression. He said, relative prices cannot speak because of the wage equalization mechanisms within countries. So we're not talking about things like the shocks, for example, in real exchange rates that move the relative prices, at the country level. In addition, the mobility of firms often is reduced because of agglomeration externalities and coordination failures. For example, when you have a cluster of firms in one place, and you may have an advantage of moving this cluster to another place, who is going to be the first firm to move, right? This is typically a coordination issue. Therefore, I think Tony made really very strong rationale that this policies should contain place-based elements. He focused on infrastructure capital for integration of places, the idea that this need to be a package, and also that place-based policies could help addressing the trade-offs between equity and efficiency. I think is a very important point. So I think all these issues have been very important for the management of the current COVID crisis. So not only the impact of the crisis has been extremely asymmetric across territories, but also of the policies put in place to fight the economic shock, like partial unemployment, the grants or loans, or to guarantees to firms, required, in some sense, a lot of help from the subnational governments to be implemented. Regional and city governments have been extremely active to reach some segments of the population, like for example, young people, migrants, that typically do not have access to nationwide uniform support measures. And there is, for example, evidence that in rural areas, local governments have helped to deal with the sanitary emergency, creating new ways of providing health services and facilitate the adoption of digital tools. The COVID crisis also particularly affected certain sectors like tourism. For example, in the OECD, we projected that tourism this year the decline can go from 60 to 80%. So basically a shutdown of international tourism in 2020. So restaurants, culture. In all these sectors, self-employment and more precarious forms of employment, like for example, part-time, are really pervasive. Without the action from some national governments, the effects of the crisis could have been much more damaging. So I think all this is also very important for this environmental and digital transitions. I mean, the future of Europe. I think there is a lot of evidence that the transition to a low carbon economy requires a sort of more granular approach because our energy production system is becoming much more distributed. Also in cities, the possibility of teleworking are changing the relative advantage of city centers versus the periphery and even rural areas. In the past, epidemic shocks in cities have little impact on the attractiveness of urban areas because basically the economy was moving indeed towards these services and required proximity. Today, we have the digital technologies that can replace physical by digital proximity. So this is a change. So when you look at these shocks in cities in the past, they've been not very helpful to understand what's going to happen now. So the COVID crisis accelerated this transition, and we have now more options to decide on the optimal location where we live and work. So this is a sort of change in what we call a spatial equilibrium between cities and less dense areas that can generate a lot of opportunities for lagging territories and avoid at the same time this sort of over congestion of cities. So the rural areas could benefit from delocalization of jobs and distant forms of work. This is important for the service sector, which typically requires density. It's very difficult to develop service sectors in places where there is low density. For the manufacturing sector, there are also new forms of additive, or we call distributed manufacturing, that could help relocate some of our industrial activities back in our country. So all this debate about relocalization. And often, what is very important is often the competencies related to, for example, active labor market policies, which are particularly important to manage these transitions, are the responsibility of subnational governments. Also, policies related to training and skills are often at the regional city level. For example, in France, the skills and training policy are at the regional level. On climate, regions and cities often have a jurisdiction of crucial sectors for climate action. So these include buildings, part of the transportation sector, and other local infrastructure. Generally, 55% of all public spending on sectors directly associated with climate change is done at the subnational level. It's not done by central levels. And actually, when you look at investment, I'm talking about the OECD, 65% of public investment sustaining the low carbon transition is done by region and city governments. I think these subnational levels of government can also boost the circular economies, such as waste management. Regional planning and regulation, for example, on transportation can guide private investment in a way that is consistent with this transition. Last but not least, regions and cities are in close contact with citizens. This was also stressed, and citizens and local firms. So they are prime vectors for ensuring this kind of popular support of the required policy choices. So to sum, I think as stressed by Commissioner Ferreira and Laurence, I think it's very important that these territorial dimensions are taken into consideration in all this effort for the recovery and resilience in Europe. If not, if they're not taken into account enough, there is a risk that perhaps a more sectoral approach may be followed, or even in some extreme cases, we just go into subsidies. And we know this is not the most efficient way of organizing the recovery and structural change in our economies. Now, of course, in order to implement this approach, we need several things. And one of the most important investments, the sort of investment that needs to be done, is this idea of multi-level governance. This is what ensures that different policy lines are coordinated, that different levels of government are aligned, and at the horizontal level, for example, a number of municipalities are cooperating in, for example, a metropolitan area. So this multi-level governance investment is very important and should not be neglected, but often the problem is that politicians often prefer big infrastructural projects. They're more visible than this kind of soft investment, but of course this is totally essential, and this is what makes the difference. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joachim. And it's really impressive because it seems that obviously you stress how negative the impact of the COVID crisis has been on and dramatic on a lot of sectors and citizens. But you also stress some optimistic avenues by thinking that this is also opportunity to rethink the development of territories. And I think we will have a lot of questions about that and really real initiatives that has been implemented in this context. So now I want to leave the floor to Charlotte Alpern. I recall that Charlotte is a researcher at Sciences Po and the Center of European Studies. And Charlotte, you will give us, to a certain extent, really the perspective of a researcher on this topic.
Yes, thank you, Yann. Well, thank you very much to Shiv Shamava and to Yann Algan for having me and participate in this panel. It's a great opportunity, so thank you to both of you. I will indeed take the view of a researcher to bring my own perspective in this, but I will also try to address some of the key issues of the panel in terms of try to highlight what could be potential solutions. So try to bring in the analysis and the work that I've been doing comparatively across Europe on cities and on territories, but also try to bring in an optimistic sort of perspective and convince you that yes, indeed, climate policies need to be less spatially blind in the future, and very much like the way through which Elisa Ferreira started her own speech about that. For too long have climate policies in the EU, but not only, been spatially blind, focusing for lots of reasons on the global scales, on developing and building analytics at the global level in order to face the climate crisis. But if we go back to the long history of territories in the EU, it is not just at a territorial level that we're going to find some barriers and some problems and some challenges, but it is also the place where a number of opportunities, a number of resources, a lot of that energy that has been referred to by some of the other speakers in this panel has been found in the past. And in order to illustrate this, I would like to focus on three different points. The first point I would like to make is that when we talk about territories, we are indeed talking about local governance. We're talking about institutions, we're talking about cities, we're talking about regions, we're talking about different levels of governance, but territories in a way are not just a local scale. They can also be, and this has been the case in Europe in the past, they can also be collective actors, being places where collective action can be developed, either politically steered or pushed by social or economic actors, but many places where solutions and partnerships can be built and developed. So territories as a place for collective action, as a place to steer new governance arrangements, as a way to think about collective actions more generally. The second point that I think is quite important to keep in mind is the fact that when we look at how those territories, and more specifically cities and regions, have answered the climate crisis in the past, they have done so in two different ways. On the one hand, we see that there has been a number of cities and regions at the forefront as pioneers in finding solutions to the climate crisis, in working together with NGOs, in working together with the private sector, in developing some infrastructures and some investments in order to experiment with new ways of addressing some of the key challenges in terms of decarbonizing transport, for example, or inventing new ways to feed the cities and to develop some new partnerships with the rural areas at the fringes of those large metropolitan areas, but also to think about more cleaner energy sources. And one of the key challenges for those large cities or for those front runners is now to scale up. It's now to build on this sum of small scale experiments to profoundly transform the way through which not only policy priorities are set, but the way through which decision-making processes are being organized at the city, at the regional level. And I will come back to this in a moment, but this is one of the challenges. And of course, digitization and technology can offer part of the answer, but there's certainly more to it than this. We can also think about the way through which networks and utilities are being optimized, and this is part of the work that has been done in partnership or through the private sector, but more generally, governance arrangements also need to be reorganized at a more metropolitan level or at the regional scale in order to make sure that political regulation can also be developed at this particular scale. The second type of territories we would find in Europe are the smaller territories, or some of the territories that are located in more degrowth areas where there is a large amount of economic and social issues to be faced with, in particular with the climate crisis. And some of those were referred to by other speakers in this panel before. And in those small municipalities, all those areas or post-industrial areas, we might call them this way, maybe one of the tasks of Europe in the future is also to show and to offer alternative models of development and ways to develop their own pathways towards sustainable transitions. I've been doing some research lately on smaller cities in Europe, for example, in Greece or in Lithuania or in Romania, for example, where there has been some attempts by local policymakers to develop some cycling paths, to develop some decarbonized mobility approaches. And in this case, their challenge is, in a number of cases, not the fact that they lack resources, but the fact that they lack opportunities at the national level, because a lot of the policy frameworks at the national level do not take into account possibilities to unlock those choices and those priorities in these very small cities or in those rural areas that have not been the focus of attention of the largest share of national policies. So we have those two different type of territories if you want to speak in broad typologies, but in a sense, it shows that on the one hand, we need to think about scaling up and the different ways and mechanisms to achieve that. And on the other hand, to think about the enabling factors to offer also some opportunities and some alternatives to those areas, to those territories within national frameworks, which until now have not been the focus of sufficient attention in terms of both policy resources, but also in terms of regulation, enabling them to develop their own experiments with solutions to the climate crisis. So the third point I would like to make this evening, and then I will stop here for the moment, is that there is a need in order to address transitions that are also socially and socially inclusive and more just, a need to refocus on local governance and maybe to build and to challenge maybe a little bit, if I may be so bold, some of the work that is being done at the national level to push for more institutional competition maybe, and to offer some opportunity for those territories that are very much wanting to develop some efforts to be able to do so, and for those that do not have the possibility or think it is extremely complicated to do so because of the barriers that they're facing within this multi-level governance framework that Joaquin Rivera was referring to before, are not going to develop because of that. So in this context, EU policies and EU procedures can continue, on the one hand, to push for new priorities, and I think Elisa Ferreira has mentioned some of them, such as digitization on the one hand, such as pushing for new priorities to be developed and mainstreamed through that, the EU, and indeed to make sure that cohesion is not only considered something old-fashioned, but very much reorganized in the light of the climate crisis. But in parallel to that and to the content of those policies, there is also a need to strengthen and enhance capacity building and governance arrangements in order to enable those policymakers, politicians, citizens at the local level to be bold and to be able, through either resources in terms of funding, but also in terms of knowledge, analytics, in terms of organizations, or in terms of authority, to be able to develop these policies. And this is probably one of the big challenges between or within institutions at the EU level, but it is also part, I think, and drawing on the work I've been doing and working together with my colleagues here at Sciences Po at the Urban School, working on comparatively across Europe. It's probably one of the key challenges to make sure that those policies do not remain spatially blind in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for sharing this really great insight. What I suggest now is move to some Q&A. We have 15 up to 20 minutes together to share some question. So please, everyone, feel free to ask questions with the chat, and then I will ask them to our guest speakers. But may I start with one question to all of you? First, by asking you if you have great example of initiatives that really work at the local level. And I will have an additional question. If you could also give us what are the conditions of success of this initiative. You all have, to a certain extent, stressed the tension between the fact that we need to have smart specialization at the local level, and we need to have, to a certain extent, bottom-up initiatives. But on the other hand, we need also some push from at the national or at the European level. So what is really the good balance between this multi-level governance? Who wants to start? Laurence?
Yeah, I would be
Yes,
happy to start. And given that, of course, the very central question for Europe now is to bring Green Deal home, not a bureaucratic process, but really a process of transformation that is owned by people, by citizens, by geographies. And I would like to take the Spanish government example this day. Spain has taken quite aggressive targets on phasing out coal. But I think the very intelligent design of the policy has been not to sort of set a target like, for example, Germany has done with a particular date, and then try to struggle with the different demands of the different regions, but really began by a process of consultation and discussion, setting the obvious that finally these coal-based electricity utilities based on coal and the mines were non-profitable anymore, which is already true, and that even some companies were closing, that the best way was try to discuss with a labor union, with a regional governance, and to anticipate the evolution. And now there is a plan in particular for the north of Spain, for Asturias and some other region, where there is a plan which had been negotiated with the labor union and the local governments to what will happen once these coal power plants and the mine will close. And of course, with a system of compensation, pension for earlier pension for the miners, retraining for the younger part of this particular workforce, but at the same time trying to invent together with the local government the new activities. So the anticipation and this dialogue, which will not arrive in which a decision it is taken, and then, like Elisa mentioned or Joachim mentioned, some region in France never recovered from the closure of siderurgy, the steel industry, or for the coal mine, for example. And they never recovered. You go through these places and they are still very disenfranchised local. So this issue about you anticipate for me, it's a fantastic example. So the mines are still there, the coal power plants are still there, but they know that they're, and they are, in a way, thinking about their future. And that's what I refer to give agency to people. If people begin to think about agency, I see in Silesia, for example, there was a good effort to really put Silesia in Poland out of coal, but with a very dynamic citizen discussion and local authority. So that, in my view, it's a very good example. But of course, we certainly can have many more of them, in particular on the mobility. I'm sure many of you, I don't want to concentrate all the speeches, but the mobility, the way the many mayors have reacted to the COVID crisis and opt for softer mobility and explaining why clean air was better, I think it's quite well received now in many of these cities, and the case for Milan, for Paris, and from others. But that, I think, two examples.
May I get in?
Sure, Elisa.
Yes. Well, because I really think that what Laurence just said and the example she gave fits exactly in one of the instruments of the recovery that we are launching, and it is exactly that sort of example that we are trying to finance. So it's we have selected, we have proposed at Commission level to intervene on a local basis. We have selected around 100 specific spots on the basis of being areas where there is a very high level of emissions, CO2 and other gases, and where the percentage of the population that is dependent for jobs in those industries is very high. And so you can go, I mean, in the size, you can go on the level of NUTS 3 or smaller areas. And the ingredients for this, I mean, for success, we still are, some Spanish regions you are mentioning. Silesia was exactly in Katowice before we had COVID, impediment to traveling. And exactly what are the ingredients? And I think Charlotte was very, it was very interesting what she said, and also Joachim, because you have got really to make sure that you understand what is the problem in that area. You have got to understand what is the way forward. You have got to engage all the partners in the discussion and in the organization of this trajectory towards the future. And of course, you have to have the finance for this. So there is this engagement of a special fund of the Just Transition Fund. It's 17.5 billion. But you have to have the means. But if you don't have all these ingredients together, including the recognition from the central level of the urgency to manage the transition, you will just be caught by the changes that inevitably will occur, particularly when we are moving into this green agenda, and you are caught in a kind of protective attempt to move against the natural evolution of the economy, and then we are repeating the mistakes of the transitions in the steel industry. So I think having a vision, understanding what can be done in that area, and then having the means to do it, but engaging all the partners and And we have done some examples in the past in textile areas, for instance, in which this change was managed and it functioned. I mean, it's not easy, but it can be done. So now we are just starting to work with central governments in what kind of plans they are going to propose for the use of this Just Transition Fund that will combine this kind of regional and social funds element with more InvestEU and more bankable elements of the strategy. And this is something that should, and if you are interested, I think you are most welcomed in following up and helping to shape these transition experiments that in fact we are launching, and it covers all the countries in Europe, but by concentrating on these specific areas. So this is just I mean, an attempt. So you are all very welcome, in fact, to participate and to help to shape these plans. I thought it might be interesting as an example.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Elisa. And actually, I was echoing also a question of Gabrielle, who was asking some question of an example of successful initiatives led by young people on the territories. You know that so the audience tonight is made up of a lot of students, and there's this issue of how jobs flow also to students in the different and young people in the different territories. And also this is a key concern for them. And we do know that territories really matter now for the young people. Charlotte and Joachim, do you want to add something, or may I switch to other questions?
Yeah, I think your question is a bit tricky, because at the regional level, at the territorial level, there is no one size fits all. So even if you have a very good example in one place, nothing ensures that actually this example can be replicated in other places, right? So this is the first thing. So there are a number of very nice examples. You know, the example of Katowice that was referred by Laurence and Elisa, that so a mining specialization turning into something else. You know, by the way, using a lot of investment on culture, for example. I have examples on Sweden. I have examples, for example, in the Netherlands, in the region of Sweden, Netherlands. I also have, for example, in my country, the northern region of Portugal was a region that was very severely hit by a number of structural shocks since, I'd say, the late 90s. Remember that Portugal was exporting a lot of textiles. Imagine what this means in terms of the conversions towards the euro, the integration of Eastern European countries, you know, then the 2008 sort of crisis. So it's amazing that this northern region of Portugal has been sort of coping in all these shocks. And you take, for example, a city like the city of Braga, which is nearby Porto, the city of Porto. We have a very interesting example of sort of an ecosystem which is working very well in terms of the local governance, enterprise sector, foreign direct investment. So there are a number of examples. The problem is that we're never sure that these examples can be replicated in some sense elsewhere. One thing that is really common is these issues about leadership of leaders, mayors, presidents of region, and in some sense, these mechanisms of governance. Why this is so important? Because, you know, it's impossible for a central government to have a strategy that deals with all the specificities of regions and cities. It will be just too complex. So of course you need this decentralized level. And, you know, and this is why this multi-level governance is so important. Now, it's very important to have a push, because very often you also have at the local level a sort of established, constituencies that sometimes don't like change, don't like new things, right? So Fabrizio Barca, who is one of the fathers of regional policy in Europe, he likes to say that, you know, this push from the outside is sort of a shaking the local constituencies and finding ways of doing things. But the most important is that, you know, convincing these people, they need to have a strategy. And when they have a strategy, then we can indeed channel funds and support. don't ask them what they need. Ask them what they have to offer. And for that, they need to think about their strategy. What kind of specific assets they have locally, things that one region has and other regions do not have. Do they have, for example, a territorial capital? I have examples in the region of Champagne and Ardennes in France, where this territorial capital associated with the production of champagne was used to create a bioeconomy plant. You see what I mean? So people need to be empowered at the local level because otherwise it's too complex. But this push from the outside is very important. It's a governance push, and when people at the local level have the strategy, of course, support in terms of investments, etc. Now, one very important point is that this alignment between central and local governments is so important, because in the 2008 crisis, what we observed is that there was a stimulus, a very strong stimulus from the part of federal and central governments. But what the subnational governments were doing was exactly the opposite. Why they are doing the opposite? Because they are constrained. And the only option that you have when you have, for example, a fiscal federalism pact, or you are constrained because you cannot go into debt, where do you adjust? Where this discretionary power of subnational governments to adjust? Investment. And in 2008, we saw all the stimulus plans and actually the public investment, which is mainly done at subnational level, collapsing. And in Europe, there was a collapse of public investment just after the 2008 crisis. So it's very important, this alignment between policies decided at central level and at the subnational level. This, I think, I know with regional policy in the hands of Elisa Ferreira, I'm very confident that from this kind of disconnections will not happen, at least in terms of policies decided at European level.
Just to add something Sorry, Yann?
Yeah, sure, Charlotte, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, just maybe to add something to what Joaquim Oliveira just said, I think one of the other areas where there were lots of cuts at the local level following the 2008 crisis has been on staff. It has been on human resources, knowledge, analytics at the local level. It means that in a number of those areas, the level of knowledge and understanding and the ability to produce this diagnosis, to understand what are the opportunities that are context specific and to differentiate yourself from other areas or other territories in Europe, this has been considerably downsized, which also means that it has made a lot of those local authorities much more dependent on the private sector, for example, or on the knowledge and understanding that could be brought to them by international organizations or by the national government. So I think that part of the challenge at the moment for a number of those territories, and this is what I was referring to when I was talking about capacity building and governance, is the ability to bring together their local societies, their local economies, their citizens, to define together what goals are to be reached jointly in 10 years to go, but also to collectively think about implementation milestones. And this is maybe one of the ways to answer the question that I got in the Q&R section on how to increase the absorption capacity to enable the funding to regions that lag behind or that are heavily industrialized. We have a number of cases in France, for example, or elsewhere in Europe. If we think about some of the best practices at the moment in terms of ecological transitions, we always mention Grande-Sainte, for example, near Dunkerque, or there's always talks about Los-en-Goual, which is also in the Hauts-de-France region. There are always some talks about Greater Manchester at the moment, which is supposedly one of the fightest pioneers in the field of clean energy transitions. And if we try to remember a little bit about the 1970s and the state of cities such as Copenhagen back there, heavy debt crisis, very difficult situation in the very center of the cities, lots of wealthy populations flying away from the city centers towards the suburbs. We can see that what has been a possibility for those territories to really make it back and to invent and to develop and to innovate in the field, in different policy fields, has been their ability to set a goal for 10 years' time, and to also think about the different milestones to reach it across sectors, but also by bringing the population in. So I very much agree with what has been said. It is a complex balance between the national and the local level, and what a lot of the support that is being needed at the moment at the local level is in terms of capacity building and to enhance their analytics, but also their ability to liaise with other parts of society. Sorry, Yann, I've been too long, I think. But...
No, this is perfect. Thank you very much. And actually, it's a good, it's a good intervention as a follow-up to Clémentine Goujon's question. Clémentine is asking, I would like to know how could we participate as students to the elaboration of central government's plan to use the Just Transition Fund? Do you have an answer to that?
Well, it depends. Shall I try to answer?
You should.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, but I think probably in terms of methods for participation, I'm not the best person. Probably, I think it would be it would be Lawrence that might really bring in all her expertise on how you can engage people. I would just like to underline and trying to answer also Charlotte's comments on how the adjustment that followed up on the financial crisis reduced the capacities of certain areas, and it is one of the questions also that was put to us. In the weakest areas, often the public service and the public administration almost disappeared or became so old and so backward that it cannot sustain sufficient quality sufficient quality in the proposals to absorb the funds. This happens all, in a lot of places in Europe. One of the elements that I would like to underline is that from this borrowing that the Commission proposes to introduce in the market, one of the instruments, most important instruments to be financed by this extra borrowing is exactly this recovery and resilience instrument. And inside this instrument, what you can do is member states can finance the recovery with structural reforms. And these reforms can be even the reform of the public administration. It can be the reform of the forest management. It can be the reform of how to address medium-sized towns. So there is, I think, for the first time in Europe, this kind of acceptance of a reform as a project, as a combining several elements. This is being discussed now between the Commission and the Member States, and it is also in relation to this that I think it's very important that you have this you have this territorial awareness of when you make the reform, where does the reform impact and how? My last comment is about the participation of young people. It is absolutely essential because we need their energy and their capacity of adaptation. The young generation now is the one for which we are working. That's why the program is called Next Generation, because it's for the future. If we don't discuss now how we want to, where we want to go in 10 years' time, and we don't use the instruments, the exceptional instruments that we are creating in order to shape this new vision, I think we are killing the future for our generation that is now young, active, and wants to participate. So in relation to the Just Transition plans, at the local level, you can participate, you should discuss, you should engage, but also through all the other mechanisms that you can use, like I'm sure that Laurence will be more capable of illustrating, particularly in the case of France than myself. But the purpose is that you share your plan, you give the opportunity to people to discuss it, but then you act. But you act with a convergent approach on where you want to go.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Laurence, you might want to take the floor.
Yes, and sorry because I will have to hop off at 8:25, a little bit after. I do think that, of course, there is many ways of including citizens and to respond to the question on the youth involvement. One, of course, and applying to the Just Transition Fund, we see already the first issue is how, in particular, local government would have access to the funding. And you know, there is all the discussion on direct access or not, which of course is a very big issue. And I hope we will find a solution where the innovation that can happen in the society, in particular local level, find a direct access to that, and not only through governments only. The second element is, I do think now, my view is we have really, if we share the ideas that there is a unifying project in Europe that could be around this Green Deal as a new social contract, then I think it's really important to bring this social contract at home. So I mean, what does it take for this region of this city of this to really elaborate this new social contract? And there where I think the youth can play a big role. We have seen throughout the climate march, the willingness and the capacity of young people to challenge policies, to even go to litigation in some cases. And now they have to, in a way, make the next move, which is what kind of innovation and what kind of policies they are supporting or they want to see happen. And I see some cities opening their governance to youth representation, which I think is a very good thing. And having in the Green Deal process, and I think about Paris, I think about Milan and others, opening to the youth, giving them a seat at the table to define the future, because that's the future plan. But I do think we have really to go for on one side, giving access to the funding, and on the other side, really taking off the obstacle of scaling up, of producing innovation and sometimes scaling up. And there is a lot of issues about there. You can look at decentralization of electricity, for example, of production and consumption electricity. It could be about how you in a way reorganize local channels for food production and connection between the farmers and the schools, or the farmers and the citizen. We have already, because we have a view of very centralized economy, market-based rules, unique market. We have a lot of things which were very thought from the top down, and we have to change that and to innovate in the European governance if we want the Green Deal to be really a base of the new social contract.
Laurence, I just wanted to ask Joachim and if you want to add something, and Charlotte, and then we will close the conference.
No, I just wanted to add something was said by Elisa and Laurence on this role of students. I think, yes, there is a lot of sort of, important things that could be done in terms of research on this just transition. People often are used to work on social policies or on environmental policies. There are a lot of research and good work done on that. But on the link between the two, much less. And I think we need a lot of good academic research on these links. And this is a bit the same, like, for example, greening growth. Often economists discuss a trade-off between doing green or doing growth. And then we set up this green growth agenda. It's a bit the same like equity and efficiency. As you know, you're an economist, economist, equity, efficiency separated. Then we created this inclusive growth agenda. So we need to not make these connections between social policy and environmental policy under this kind of just transition idea. And I think students and the academic world can have a very important role there.
Maybe to add a point to this, and the role of students, well, and youth more generally, I think there are two different ways. One of the ways is to push and to challenge some of the older generations and to keep, making them aware of the changes and the novelties and the new priorities also for the younger generations to come. So this is one of the challenges, and probably, keep on voting could be also one of the ways to think about how to challenge those older generations. But this is maybe an old-fashioned way to think about representation. This is one of the ways. And then the second thing is also the way through which universities have also tried to support some of those territories in developing new solutions and new innovations. I can think of a number of cities where local authorities, in order to overcome some of the challenges we mentioned before, have went to university to find some partnerships to work together with students, to work together with young generations, but also with researchers in order to overcome some of the lack of resources, of investments that they could have before. I can think right now about research been doing lately with Lisbon, for example, in order to develop some of its digital mobility policies, but we can find similar stories in lots of other cities in Europe. So this is one of the things. And finally, in terms of research, I think there is also a strong need of EU support in order to promote public funded research and to support the work that is being done in a comparative way across Europe to develop some more knowledge and some more analysis and some more capacity to think about those policy changes, and also the ways to bridge the gap between citizen participation on the one hand and participatory devices that have been flourishing over the past decades, but that too often do not link together with some of the policy processes and the decision-making processes. And this is maybe one of the areas where I think we collectively need to invest some time and some research and some efforts, and maybe the chair that is being opened tonight will be an opportunity to bridge this gap between the research that we're doing, but also some of the policymakers and other organizations that could help us make this happen. So this could be the final word I will have in my hand.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And actually, it resonates with some of the question on how we can rebuild trust also between expert institution and citizens. Well, this is a really an exciting panel, and I'm really frustrating by the fact that now we are running late and this is time to conclude. So I really want to thank on behalf of Sciences Po, the Commissioner Elisa Ferreira, Laurence Toubiana, Charlotte Alpern, and Joachim Oliveira. And thank you very much to all the students and our partners. I know that there has been a lot of attendance from our students. Thank you very much for the launching of this new chair. And we really look forward to actually work all together to provide a new solution to the climate transition and inclusive territories. Thank you so much for everyone. Sciences Po.